Call the police. I want him removed immediately.
That's your final decision.
This document confirms controlling shareholder authority. What document is that? What is he trying to do? No, that can't be right.
Keep reading.
The voting rights transfer has been legally activated. His total voting control now exceeds 60%.
60%, that's impossible. You should have read the agreement. You should absolutely call the police. But before they arrive, someone should explain this.
What is that?
The transfer didn't come from me.
The verified voting authority now exceeds 60%. No, that's impossible.
You thought I had no power. You never bothered to learn who built this company. And now everyone knows.
The conference room went silent the moment CEO Victoria Ashcroft slammed a folder onto the table in front of Desmond Raines. She accused the quiet black single father of stealing source code worth billions, then ordered the doors locked from the inside. "Call the police," Victoria said, loud enough that 200 employees watching the live feed could hear every syllable. Security personnel moved toward him, but Desmond didn't run and didn't explain himself. He placed a black envelope on the table and asked the board chairman whether he had ever read the conversion clause. 10 seconds later, Victoria's face went white. Stay until the end, because 60% of the company was not the most dangerous secret Desmond carried into that room. Aurelius Nexus was the kind of company that people in Charlotte described as a quiet giant, a data security firm that almost nobody recognized by name, but whose infrastructure protected the medical records of millions of patients across 7 states. The emergency board meeting had been called at 6 in the morning on a Tuesday, and by the time Desmond Raines walked into the main conference room on the 14th floor, every senior leader in the building had already been seated for 20 minutes. Victoria Ashcroft stood at the front of the room, with the composure of someone who had rehearsed this moment many times, her dark blazer pressed, her voice carrying the particular flatness of someone who had already decided the outcome before the conversation began. She clicked to the first slide and told the room that the core platform source code had been copied sometime in the previous 72 hours, and that an internal security review had traced the breach to a single account. She did not pause before putting the name on the screen. That account belonged to Desmond. The slide showed a login timestamp of 2:14 in the morning, a volume transfer of more than 4 terabytes, a device address linked to the residential neighborhood where he lived, and a destination server outside the company's verified network. Victoria let the room absorb the information before she looked at him directly, and the weight of 200 people watching through video feeds pressed into the silence like a physical thing. Desmond kept both hands flat on the table in front of him and said nothing for a full count of 5 seconds, then asked a single question. Where was the original system log stored, and who had accessed it since the incident was first flagged? Victoria did not answer directly. She said the security team had already verified the data, and that the chain of custody was intact. Maren Caldwell, a senior data engineer who had worked under Desmond for 4 years, stood up from her seat near the back wall before anyone asked her to speak. She said it clearly and without hesitation. Desmond's account did not have unilateral access to the data vault where that volume of records was stored, and any transfer at that scale would have required a second layer of administrative override that his credentials alone could not provide. Victoria thanked her for her input and told her she was suspended, effective immediately, pending her own review. The room shifted, and the people who had been leaning forward sat back. Everett Blackstone, the board chairman, adjusted his cufflinks and told Desmond that the board expected him to surrender his workstation, his phone, his access card, and the physical key to the server room. Desmond placed his employee badge on the table. He did not touch anything else. Victoria said that withholding the requested items constituted obstruction, and then said the words she had been planning to say from the beginning of the meeting, called the police. Nolan Whitaker, the corporate security director, stepped forward and positioned himself between Desmond and the door. Desmond looked at Nolan without any expression of fear or anger, then reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and placed a black envelope on the center of the table. He did not open it himself. He looked at Celeste Rowan, the company's general counsel, and told her he needed her to read Article 14 of the shareholder agreement aloud. Celeste's expression did not change, but she picked up the envelope, broke the seal, and began to read. The room was still processing the first paragraph when the color left Victoria Ashcroft's face entirely. Victoria laughed first, a short, controlled sound that she shaped into contempt, and called the document a delay tactic from a man trying to hide behind paperwork. She told the room that equity position did not grant immunity from criminal investigation, and that the board would continue exactly as planned. Desmond said she was right. He agreed that ownership proved nothing about innocence, and that the investigation should proceed on its merits. But he said there were 4 specific things his position now entitled him to do, effective immediately, regardless of what anyone in the room thought about timing or optics. He said them evenly, like a list of facts rather than a declaration of war. He was entitled to freeze all intellectual property transfer agreements currently pending, demand an independent forensic audit of the breach, suspend the CEO's administrative access to core systems during any investigation that named him as a subject, and call an emergency shareholder meeting within 72 hours. Victoria turned to Everett and told him to have Nolan escort Desmond out of the building. Everett looked at Celeste. Celeste was still reading the document. Nolan did not move. He had been in corporate security for 22 years, and he understood, in a way that the attorneys in the room were still catching up to, that the man standing at that table now held legal authority over the building they were all standing inside of. Desmond said he would like to invite a third party into the meeting by video call. A woman named Lenora Hayes joined the screen, 48 years old, precise in her speech, dressed in a dark gray suit, and sitting in front of a wall of organized document files. She identified herself as legal counsel for the Locke Innovation Trust, and confirmed 3 things in the order she had prepared them. Desmond's 34% founding stake had never been diluted or transferred, not through any of the restructuring agreements signed in the previous 3 years. The Locke Innovation Trust held 16% of voting rights in the company, and its governing documents specified that those rights transferred to the trust's oversight manager, Desmond, upon verified evidence of governance breach by the executive leadership. And third, the convertible capital instrument that Desmond had used to backstop the company's liquidity crisis 3 years prior had converted to 10% voting equity that very morning, triggered by the CEO's order to freeze his shareholder access without due process. Everett Blackstone asked for clarification on the conversion clause, because the ownership summary provided to the board had listed Desmond's holdings at somewhere around 20%. Celeste told him, without looking up from the documents in front of her, that the shareholder reports provided to the board had been missing several attachments for at least 2 annual cycles. The room did not immediately understand what that meant, but Everett did. His jaw tightened in a way that was visible from across the table. Victoria tried one more time, and her voice carried the controlled urgency of someone who knew the script was slipping. She told the room that Desmond had clearly spent years engineering this moment, and that using legal leverage to escape accountability was exactly the kind of bad faith the board had a responsibility to identify and call out. Desmond waited for her to finish. Then he said something quietly enough that the people near the back of the room had to lean in. He said she was welcome to call the police, that he would cooperate fully with any investigation, but that before the officers arrived, he would very much like someone to explain why the person currently sitting in the CEO's chair had been routing the company's data through a server funded by a competing firm. He let that sit for exactly 3 seconds. Then he said that the 4 terabytes the board had been told he stole contained something none of them had been informed about, a digital fingerprint that traced directly back to one specific administrative account, and the account was not his. 3 years before that Tuesday morning, Desmond Raines had been the person most likely to be the next chief executive of Aurelius Nexus, and he had declined the opportunity without a second conversation. His co-founder, a man named Adrian Locke, had built the company with him from nothing. 2 engineers with a shared obsession about data architecture, and a shared conviction that medical infrastructure was the most important and most underprotected technology in the country. Adrian had been the one who talked to investors, gave keynotes, and charmed the board into believing that two people working out of a converted office space in Charlotte could build something that genuinely mattered at scale. Desmond had been the one who actually built it. The division of labor had never felt unequal because neither of them measured it that way, and because the thing they were building was more important than the credit attached to it. When Adrian died, quickly, after a diagnosis that moved faster than anyone around him had prepared for, the board asked Desmond within 2 weeks whether he was ready to step into the CEO role. He said he was not, and he meant it. He was a single father whose daughter had just started high school. A man who had spent the previous year watching his co-founder lose the ability to walk and then breathe while still managing to protect the company's foundational technology from investors who wanted to extract value from it before fully understanding what they were extracting. He was not interested in press conferences or quarterly earnings calls. He wanted to finish what he and Adrian had started, and he trusted that the board would find someone capable of handling the parts of the job he genuinely did not want, while leaving the infrastructure in the hands of the people who had designed it. Victoria Ashcroft came in with an impressive track record and a public presence that immediately reassured the kind of investors who preferred their CEOs telegenic and their engineers invisible. In her first year, she cut operating costs by 18%, signed 3 significant healthcare network contracts, and gave a widely circulated interview in which she described the company's platform as infrastructure built for scale, without mentioning the 2 people who had spent 5 years designing every layer of it. Desmond watched all of this and said nothing publicly. Privately, he began making notes. Over the following 2 years, Victoria moved with patience. She transferred the engineers most loyal to Desmond's development philosophy to peripheral divisions, where their access to core systems was reduced. She had his name quietly removed from the company's public product timeline, replacing it with language about a founding team that made individual contribution deliberately difficult to trace. She asked him to sign a series of agreements she described as routine IP consolidation, and when he declined the third one, she told the board he was an engineer who had outlived his usefulness and resisted modern governance thinking. What Victoria did not know was that Desmond had spent those same 2 years doing something else entirely. He had retained copies of every governing document. He had tracked every ownership transfer and flagged the ones that appeared designed to dilute his position without his knowledge or consent. He had built a secondary backup system for the platform's core source code and stored it on infrastructure that was not visible on any network topology document that Victoria's team would have reviewed. He had completed the conditions that converted his bridge capital into voting equity and said nothing to anyone except Lenora Hayes. And he had commissioned a private forensic audit of the company's financial reporting through the trust that Adrian had established, an audit that had been running for 11 months before the Tuesday morning meeting. His daughter Harper had asked him once over dinner why he let other people claim credit for the work he had done. He told her that sometimes the most dangerous thing a person could do was show their cards before the other players had committed fully to their bets, and that there was a difference between silence that came from fear and silence that came from patience. She had looked at him the way teenagers look at parents who say things that don't quite make sense yet, and he had let it stand at that. Back in the conference room, Desmond turned to the technical evidence that Victoria had presented, and he did it with the precise, unhurried manner of a man who had designed the system being discussed and knew exactly where each assumption in the analysis was wrong. The first problem with the timeline was physical. His home network operated on a residential internet connection with a documented maximum upload speed, and the transfer of 4 terabytes of compressed source code to an external server in the window described would have required a sustained throughput that his connection could not produce. Not in that window. Not under any realistic conditions. He said he would provide the connection logs from his internet service provider, which he had requested at 4 in the morning when Marin first called him with the alert. The second problem was authentication. The data vault where the stolen material was stored used a two-layer verification system, a design Desmond himself had written into the platform 3 years earlier. Bypassing the second authentication layer required not just account credentials, but an active administrative override key, and those keys were assigned to exactly 3 people in the organization: the CEO, the security director, and the head of network infrastructure. His own account had been downgraded to standard engineer access 14 months earlier, a change that should have appeared in the access audit trail. If the breach had used his credentials to reach that vault, without triggering an access denial error, it meant whoever performed the breach had also used one of those 3 administrative keys simultaneously, and done so in a way that overwrote the standard error response. Nolan Whitaker said aloud, without being prompted, that he had not logged into any company system after 7 the previous evening, and that he was willing to submit his complete access history for independent verification immediately. That left 2 names. Victoria said the logs could have been altered by anyone with sufficient system knowledge, which happened to describe Desmond precisely. Desmond said he agreed and asked that the original hardware audit file, stored on a physically isolated server, not on the primary network, be retrieved and reviewed by someone independent of the company's current executive team. The IT manager on call said that particular file appeared to have been corrupted. Marin Caldwell said, from the back of the room where she was technically no longer supposed to be present, that she had backed up a copy of that file before her suspension was processed. She had transferred it to a personal encrypted drive at approximately 6:45 that morning, before she left the building. She produced the drive. The backup showed a series of events that had not appeared in the version Victoria's team had presented to the board. It showed an administrative override key registered to the executive office suite, being used to bypass the vault's second authentication layer. It showed the data being routed to a server registered to a consulting firm called Meridian Strategies Group. And it showed a financial relationship between Meridian Strategies Group and a larger entity called Carrington Global Infrastructure, a technology conglomerate run by a man named Thaddeus Carrington, who had been making quiet inquiries about acquiring Aurelius Nexus for the better part of 18 months. Victoria said Marin had clearly prepared the drive in coordination with Desmond, and that its contents should be treated as compromised evidence. Celeste told the room that she was formally requesting that no further characterizations of any evidence be made by any party with a financial interest in the outcome, and that the next step was authorization of an external forensic review. The front desk called upstairs to say that 2 officers had arrived at the building's lobby. The investigators did not ask for Desmond Raines. They asked for the person whose name appeared on a formal evidence preservation notice that had been filed with the district attorney's office at 7:15 that morning. That name was Victoria Ashcroft. Victoria had designed the police's arrival as the final act of a performance she had rehearsed for weeks. The moment where Desmond was escorted out in front of his colleagues, his access permanently revoked, his credibility destroyed before a single line of actual investigation had begun. The logic was clean. A person arrested on suspicion of intellectual property theft would be consumed by legal proceedings, their shareholder rights frozen during the investigation under the company's own bylaws, their ability to call emergency meetings suspended. By the time any of it got sorted out, the agreement with Carrington would be finalized. The board would have approved the transaction under emergency provisions, and she would be well past the point where Desmond's 60% of anything could stop her. What Victoria had not prepared for was Celeste Rowan, who had arrived at the office at 5:30 that morning, after receiving an encrypted file from an attorney she did not initially recognize. The file contained 3 items: a formal complaint alleging fabrication of digital evidence, an evidence preservation order naming the company's executive systems as subject to immediate hold, and a preliminary summary of the financial relationship between Meridian Strategies Group, Carrington Global, and a payment account registered to a shell company whose sole beneficiary was a trust associated with the CEO's family office. Celeste had read all 3 documents, forwarded them to the district attorney's commercial crimes division with a cover note, and walked into the board meeting, knowing that the officers who arrived would not be following the script that had been written for them. She had said nothing about any of this during the meeting, because Desmond had asked her not to, and because she had learned, in 17 years of corporate law, that the best moment to present evidence was the moment when the other side had fully committed to the alternative version of events. The 2 investigators who entered the conference room did not make arrests. They explained that they were there to execute a preservation request, and that all parties named in the complaint, which included both Desmond and Victoria, were required to surrender devices relevant to the investigation. Desmond placed his work laptop and company phone on the table without being asked. Victoria said her personal phone contained privileged communications protected under her employment agreement and that she would need to consult her attorney before complying. The investigators noted her response in their log. Everett Blackstone attempted to reframe the situation as an internal corporate dispute, being elevated prematurely to a law enforcement matter, and asked whether the board could be given 48 hours to resolve the underlying issues through governance channels. Desmond took a document from the folder Lenora had sent and placed it on the table in front of Everett. It was a series of email exchanges between Everett's private advisory account and a financial intermediary who had been paid consulting fees by Carrington Global in the 30 days preceding the board meeting. Everett said he had been unaware of any direct conflict of interest, that he had understood the arrangement as standard market intelligence work. Celeste pointed out that the company's ethics policy required disclosure of any financial relationship with a potential acquirer regardless of the nature of that relationship, and that this disclosure had never been made. The board members who had arrived expecting to ratify a suspension and a data theft finding were now sitting in a room that felt entirely different from the one they thought they had walked into. 2 of them excused themselves to consult personal legal counsel. Victoria looked at Desmond across the table and said, quietly, that she had underestimated him. It was not an apology. It was the moment when a very intelligent person acknowledges, without stating it plainly, that they have been playing the wrong game entirely. Desmond did not respond. He checked his phone, read a text message, and passed the device to Celeste. The message was from Malcolm Sterling, the company's chief financial officer. It said she didn't just sell the data. She sold the company twice. The office where Malcolm Sterling finally told the full story was on the 22nd floor of a building 3 blocks from Aurelius Nexus's headquarters, a space rented by an independent law firm with no existing relationship to either the company or any of its investors. Malcolm arrived looking like a man who had not slept in 2 days, which was accurate, and who had spent most of those hours deciding whether protecting himself or telling the truth was the smarter short-term strategy. He had concluded, with the help of his own attorney and a careful reading of his personal legal exposure, that the 2 things were no longer separable, and that the only version of events that ended with him keeping anything he cared about was the one where he said everything he knew before being asked. He spread the documents across the conference table in order. The first agreement was a licensing arrangement between Aurelius Nexus and Carrington Global Infrastructure, structured as a platform access deal under which Carrington would gain rights to deploy the company's core security architecture within its own infrastructure network, in exchange for a substantial upfront payment and ongoing royalties. This agreement had been signed by Victoria acting under a board resolution that had never been formally voted on, backdated through a procedural mechanism that the company's bylaws did not permit. The second agreement was different in structure and destination. It transferred a complete copy of the platform's source code to an investment vehicle registered in Luxembourg, which listed among its beneficial owners a trust account connected to the Ashcroft family office. Victoria had, in effect, licensed the technology to an outside company and simultaneously transferred ownership of the technology to herself. If both agreements were enforced simultaneously, Aurelius Nexus would face competing claims from two parties, one of which was its own CEO. The resulting litigation would take years and cost more than the company's current liquid assets. In the chaos, the board would have no viable path except a distressed sale of remaining assets. Carrington would have the resources to acquire those assets at a fraction of their real value, since he had structured his original payment as recoverable in the event of a legal dispute over the underlying rights. Victoria would have already moved the source code transfer into her personal vehicle before any court could freeze the transaction. Desmond listened to all of this without interrupting. When Malcolm finished, Desmond asked him 4 questions: whether he had the originals of both agreements, whether the payment records were intact, whether he had received any direct personal benefit from either transaction, and whether he was prepared to testify to everything he had just described. Malcolm said yes to the first 2, explained that he had signed certain financial summaries under threat of termination and loss of his retirement benefits, and said he was prepared to cooperate fully. Desmond told him clearly that cooperation was not the same as immunity, and that the people whose medical data Victoria had exposed deserved a complete accounting of every decision that had contributed to it. While that meeting was happening, Victoria had reached out to 3 financial news outlets with a prepared statement describing Desmond as a disgruntled co-founder attempting to use a criminal investigation to execute a hostile takeover. The statement was sophisticated and designed to create enough narrative uncertainty that coverage would feel obligated to present both sides before the forensic picture was fully assembled. What she could not control was the notification that arrived from the regional hospital network that accounted for 30% of the company's annual revenue. Their security team had identified a dataset consistent with their patient records appearing in metadata attached to the compromised transfer, and they were requesting a call with the board, not the CEO, by 9 the following morning. The moment the hospital network's notification arrived, the story stopped being about a corporate power struggle and became something considerably more serious. The security platform that Desmond had spent 7 years building was supposed to be the reason that patient records stayed protected. The reason hospitals trusted a mid-sized Charlotte company, with the infrastructure touching the medical histories of more than 4 million people. Whatever else was happening in the boardroom, whatever legal maneuvers and shareholder votes and competing agreements were in motion, the possibility that data had been exposed in a transfer made for personal financial gain was not a governance problem. It was a human one, and it demanded a different kind of response. Desmond activated the emergency response protocol he had written into the system's original architecture and had never expected to use against his own company. He isolated the server cluster involved in the transfer, rotated all encryption keys for the affected network segments, and sent direct notifications to each of the company's healthcare clients explaining what was known, what was not yet known, and what steps were being taken in real time. He did not wait for a board vote to authorize the notifications. He did not soften the language to protect the company's short-term stock position. Several board members reached out within the hour to say the disclosure was premature and that the company should wait for the forensic audit to confirm the full scope before alarming clients. Desmond told them that the clients had a right to know as soon as a credible risk was identified, not as soon as it was convenient to disclose it, and that the company's long-term credibility depended entirely on whether it told the truth now. Nolan Whitaker, who had spent the previous 18 hours reviewing the building's physical security records as part of his own effort to understand how he had ended up executing an order he should have questioned, found something on the hallway camera footage from the night of the breach. At 11:47 in the evening, Victoria's executive assistant had carried a sealed envelope through the corridor connecting the executive suite to the network infrastructure room, badged in with her own credentials, and been inside for 4 minutes. When Nolan asked her about the footage directly, she said she had been asked to deliver a sealed envelope to the head of network infrastructure. She had not been told what was inside. She had done what her employer asked. The head of network infrastructure, a man named Garrett Hale, had not come to work that morning. His access badge had been deactivated overnight under an administrative request from the executive suite, and his personal phone went unanswered. The investigators noted all of this and issued a formal request for his voluntary appearance. Marin, working from a borrowed laptop in the firm's emergency workspace, found something embedded in the deletion script scheduled to run at midnight. Inside the command sequence, buried under several layers of obfuscation, was a code signature, a particular way of structuring authentication handshakes that had been Desmond's personal development style in the platform's earliest iteration, before he had shifted to a different methodology in the year following Adrienne Locke's death. The signature was unmistakably his. It was also from a version of the codebase that no one currently at the company would have had access to unless they had obtained it from a source that predated Victoria's tenure entirely, and unless they had known, specifically, that it existed. Desmond recognized the signature before Marin finished explaining where she had found it. It came from a private repository that he and Adrienne had maintained during the platform's initial development phase, a version control archive that had never been migrated to the company's official systems, because it contained not just working code but years of design notes and architectural decisions that the two of them had considered too foundational to expose to standard corporate access controls. After Adrienne died, the archive had been transferred to the Locke Innovation Trust's document storage as part of the estate settlement, under the understanding that it would be preserved but never distributed without the oversight manager's explicit authorization. Lenora Hayes reviewed the trust's access log within the hour. 3 months earlier, Everett Blackstone had formally requested access to the archive under the stated purpose of conducting a valuation review of the company's founding intellectual property, a category of board oversight that the trust's documents technically permitted. The access had been granted for a 48-hour review window. What the log also showed was that a file extraction had occurred during that window, a compressed archive of the earliest version of the codebase, including the authentication signature that had now appeared inside the deletion script. Everett, when confronted with the log in the presence of his attorney, said that Victoria had told him the archive review was a standard due diligence step, and that he had passed the extracted file to her team as requested. He said he had been told it was needed to verify existing patent filings. He said he had no idea it would be used the way it had been used. Victoria, by this point, had stopped making statements through her communications team and had issued a single line through her personal attorney. She would not speak to matters under active investigation. The forensic picture was now complete enough to reconstruct in sequence. Someone had obtained Desmond's old development signature from the trust archive. A virtual machine had been created using that signature as its authentication identity, generating a system trail that would appear, on surface-level review, to belong to Desmond. The data vault had been accessed using one of the 3 administrative override keys, which narrowed the source to one person given that Nolan had already provided a clean timeline, and Garrett Hale had disappeared. The stolen data had been routed through Meridian Strategies Group to Carrington Global's network, with a payment confirmation trail the forensic team found in a deleted folder on a company server. And the deletion script had been designed to eliminate every piece of evidence in this chain at midnight, using Desmond's old signature to make it look like a final act of cleanup by the person being framed. The sequence had been sophisticated. It had also, in 3 places, left traces on systems that Victoria did not know existed. The offline hardware audit server had been installed by Desmond before Victoria's arrival, and was not visible on any network topology document her team would have reviewed. The trust's access log was maintained by an external legal firm with no connection to the company's internal infrastructure, and the metadata embedded in the stolen data package itself contained a watermark, a single identifier that Desmond had embedded in every major platform release since the 2nd year of operation, invisible to standard export tools, readable only by a utility he had written himself, and kept on a personal device he used exclusively for architecture reviews. The watermark proved not only that the data originated from his systems, but that it had left through a transfer he had not initiated. Lenora informed him that the emergency shareholder meeting would proceed the following morning, that the trust's position was fully documented, and that everything was ready for confirmation. He thanked her, went home, made dinner for his daughter, and said nothing about what was happening, because there would be time for that later, and because she deserved one quiet evening while he still had the ability to give it to her. The emergency shareholder meeting opened at 9 in the morning in the same conference room, where Victoria had ordered the doors locked 48 hours earlier. The chairs were arranged the same way, and the screen at the front of the room was the same screen. But the people sitting at the table had changed. Some of them had attorneys beside them now, and the ones who did not look like they wished they had. Victoria arrived with 2 lawyers, and a posture that suggested she still believed, or needed to appear to believe, that the outcome was not yet determined. She had spent the previous day constructing a case that Desmond's 60% voting position was legally defective on 3 separate grounds. First, that his founding share position was subject to a standstill provision from a refinancing agreement signed 4 years prior. Second, that the trust's trigger conditions had not been certified by an independent auditor, making the 16% voting activation premature and unenforceable. And third, that the convertible instrument's conversion had been triggered by a routine security measure rather than a qualifying shareholder rights violation, meaning the 10% conversion had not been legitimately activated. Lenora Hayes addressed each argument in the order it had been raised. The standstill provision Victoria cited applied to the transfer of shares, not to the exercise of existing voting rights. A distinction made explicit in the refinancing agreement's own definition section, which Lenora quoted directly. The trust's trigger conditions had been certified by an independent auditor at 6 the previous evening. The certification was already filed with the state's securities authority. And the nature of Victoria's access freeze order, issued simultaneously with a public accusation of criminal conduct, before any external investigation had been initiated, and using language that the company's own bylaws categorized as a shareholder rights action, satisfied the conversion trigger regardless of the intent she now attributed to it. The documents were filed. The conversion had occurred. The 60% was not a legal claim being advanced. It was a matter of record. Desmond spoke for the first time since sitting down. He said he was not going to use 60% of the company's voting power to install himself as its permanent leader, and that he wanted to be clear about that before any of the next steps were discussed. What he intended to do with his voting position was specific and limited. He proposed 4 resolutions: Victoria's immediate suspension, pending the criminal investigation; Everett Blackstone's removal from the board chairmanship; the nullification of all intellectual property transfer agreements executed outside of proper shareholder approval; and the appointment of an independent interim executive, selected by a committee that did not include him. Victoria said something sharp about the difference between holding equity and earning the right to lead. Desmond looked at her and said that he had spent 3 years watching what happened when someone confused the right to lead with the right to take, and that he had no interest in making the same mistake from the other direction. The vote took 11 minutes. Victoria was suspended by a margin of 60 to 40. Everett tendered his resignation rather than face a formal removal vote. Malcolm Sterling's administrative access was suspended pending the investigation's outcome. Celeste Rowan was designated as the board's interim legal compliance officer, reporting to the full membership rather than to the executive office. All pending transfer agreements were voided. When the meeting adjourned, the investigators who had been waiting in the lobby were allowed upstairs, this time with a more detailed warrant and a forensic team. Victoria's corporate devices were collected. Everett's communications were placed under preservation order. The board members who remained filed out in a quiet that was different from the silence 48 hours earlier. Less stunned, more accountable. Aware that the architecture of the company they thought they had been overseeing had always been more complicated than the reports they had been reading. Victoria stood before she left the room and asked Desmond a question that had clearly been forming for a long time. If he had held 60% from the beginning, and if he had known what she was planning, why had he waited this long to end it? He said it was because he needed to know something before he used what he had. He needed to know who would protect the company, who would protect her when she made her move, and who would say nothing because they believed silence was safe when a man like him appeared to have no power. He said the answer to all three questions was now in the room and that it was useful to have it. In the months that followed, the story of Aurelius Nexus moved through the legal system with the deliberate pace of complex cases involving multiple jurisdictions and overlapping charges. Victoria Ashcroft faced a federal investigation covering trade secret theft, securities fraud, evidence tampering, obstruction, and breach of fiduciary duty. Her stock options were voided under the company's ethics clause, effective from the date the forensic timeline established that planning had begun. The accounts connected to the Luxembourg investment vehicle were frozen. Her attorney's statements evolved over time from confident denial to partial acknowledgement to a request for a cooperation agreement that the prosecutors were still evaluating months later. Everett Blackstone resigned from every board position he held in the weeks after the meeting and issued a public statement, acknowledging that he had prioritized financial opportunity over governance responsibility and had failed the shareholders he was supposed to represent. He was not charged criminally, but a negotiated settlement with the Securities Authority required him to pay a substantial fine and accept a 5-year bar from serving in any director capacity. Malcolm Sterling cooperated fully, provided a complete account of every financial document he had been asked to sign, and accepted a penalty that included repayment of compensation he had received during the period of the scheme. He lost his position and a portion of his retirement benefits, less than some believed he deserved, and more than he had been hoping to avoid. Thaddeus Carrington's company maintained publicly that it had sought to acquire legitimately licensed technology and had no knowledge of any dispute over the underlying rights. The internal communications the forensic team recovered told a more complicated story, and Carrington Global's legal exposure remained under active review. Desmond spent the 6 months after the emergency meeting doing the work he had always been more interested in than the governance fights. He convened an independent board restructuring process, created a data safety oversight committee with external membership and reporting obligations that bypassed the executive office, established a whistleblower protection policy with actual enforcement provisions, and personally led the remediation effort with the hospital network that had flagged the breach. He told their security team exactly what had happened, what had been exposed, and what had been rebuilt to prevent it from happening again. The hospital renewed their contract. 3 others followed. He did not take the CEO position immediately. He submitted an application through the transparent selection process the independent board had established, presented a strategic plan he had written without using his 60% to predetermine the outcome, and answered the committee's questions as a candidate rather than as an owner. The committee selected him. Several people who had been in the room when Victoria said, "Call the police," were present the morning the appointment was announced. Harper came to the office on a Saturday afternoon when the building was mostly quiet, walked the length of the executive floor, and looked at the view of Charlotte that Desmond had never particularly cared about, but now found himself sitting in front of every morning. She asked him whether he still drove himself to work. He said yes. She asked whether things were going to be different now. He said the work was the same. The chair was just closer to the parts of it that required decisions. She asked why he had never told her about the ownership structure, about what the family actually held. He said he had wanted her to understand what money was good for before she understood how much of it they had, that it was a tool for making choices, not a substitute for making them, and that the difference between those two things was something a person had to discover for themselves rather than be told. She looked at him the way she sometimes did, like she was filing the answer somewhere she planned to revisit. A year after the morning, Victoria had ordered the doors locked. Desmond stood at the front of that same conference room and announced a new employee equity program that transferred a meaningful portion of his personal stake to the people who had built and maintained and protected the platform through everything that had happened. Someone asked him whether giving away voting shares made him nervous. He said he had held 60% to stop one person from stealing the company's future. He had never intended to hold it permanently, and he had no interest in becoming the kind of owner the company had just spent a year recovering from. He looked around the room at the engineers and lawyers and operations staff who had each made a choice, in one way or another, during the previous 12 months, who had spoken up or stayed quiet or handed over a drive or sat with a folder in their hands and read what it said. The room was different now, not because the chairs had changed or the screen had been replaced, but because the people inside it understood that Victoria had called the police to take something from Desmond, and that what she had never accounted for was the one thing no administrative override key could touch. The fact that he had already decided, long before she made her move, exactly what this company was worth protecting, and exactly how much of himself he was willing to spend doing it.